First Things, episode number 23.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Try to be perfect and try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and it's my goal to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. Good to have you back on the show. Good to have you back with us today as we continue our discussion of procrastination. Today, we are talking about Chapter 6 of Neil Fiore's book called The Now Habit, and Chapter 6 is entitled Overcoming Blocks to Action. Now, last week, we covered what I consider to be the biggest secret to overcoming procrastination. At least it was for me. It may not necessarily be for you, but I found for a lot of people that I talk to, it is a huge, huge secret to overcoming procrastination, and it was for me, definitely. And that is the insistence on leisure and recreation in our lives. That if we withhold that from our lives, it has devastating results. In some strange way, it actually fuels more procrastination. So we say we just cannot afford to take time off, to take a vacation, to go do something fun because of all this work. And what that does, it makes it worse. It actually fuels procrastination because your body is saying, hey, I need a break. My mind needs a break. I need an outlet to do something different than this. I cannot work 24/7. And when we delusionally think we can, it sets us up for failure over and over again. Now, I gave you some homework last week, and I asked you to do at least one thing that was recreation for you, one thing that was passion for you, that was creativity for you, that was fun, that was leisure. So how did you do? Did you even do the homework? And I hope you did. Did you luxuriate in at least one thing last week? And if you did, how were your emotions? Was it rejuvenating for you? Or could it have possibly been the opposite? Did you feel guilty for doing this? And I tell you, the first time I really started pushing myself toward this, I felt incredibly guilty for this. I felt like, how dare you? You're lazy. You're not being productive. You need to be working. And I kept pushing forward because I felt there was a lot of truth in this. And eventually it became a lot better for me. I saw my productivity go through the roof. I saw myself doing things that I didn't think was humanly possible. I mentioned to you last week how I was traveling 3 hours a day, going to school, working basically 12 different classes at 3 different colleges, and working on my doctorate at the same time, plus a family. I did it. And I did it because of this very secret. I took care of myself, and I refused to let the stress and the time factor pull me away from leisure. Now, one of the most frustrating things in my life is after learning that lesson and seeing it really drilled into my head, you would think that I would just live that way from then on out, but I didn't. For some odd reason, I fell back into my old ways after I graduated and started denying myself leisure because I was in a very intense job that required that I publish. I was at a major university. It was thrilling and scary at the same time, and I just quit doing the things that worked. I quit doing my first things. And it's taken me several years now in the position that I'm in currently to say, wait a minute, I've got to get back on track. And this is why I mentioned to you several weeks ago why I started writing songs again, because this is a creative outlet for me. And I'll mention that again in today's show. But anyway, I hope that you did the homework. And if you didn't, I would encourage you to do that. When I give you some of these things, and I've been known to give you 10 action steps before, which is maybe a little overwhelming, granted. But when I do give you some of these assignments like this, I know it sounds maybe like a college class, but I really do think it will benefit you if you do go through some of these exercises that I give out to you. And I think this is a great one for you to do, to intentionally do something in your week where you have leisure and recreation. If you didn't do that, I would encourage you to do that, but don't expect miracles out of this. So don't do this and think, wow, what have I been missing? I feel so rejuvenated. I hope that's the end goal. But if you're like me, it may take you months of doing this because you know it's the right thing to do. and you know deep down this is the way to productivity, although it may seem totally counterintuitive to what you have been raised to believe. But it may take you several weeks or months before you really start relaxing and realizing the benefits of doing this. I think for me, it took about a month, maybe two, before I realized how impactful it was in my life. I could see minor benefits here and there, but it really took me a month because I was dealing with a lot of criticizing of myself, of doubting of myself, of all these voices in my head screaming at me, dealing with the procrastination in my life. I was dealing with a lot of stuff, and it took me a little while to realize, wow, I really need this in my life. And it was such a major revelation. Like I said, I don't know how I could ever turn my back on it like I did, but I'm here again telling you that this works, and I'm doing it now. And I can tell you, when I'm doing this, I can tell a huge difference in my life. When I started doing these songs again, I felt this adrenaline rush, and it's amazing. You would think, oh, wow, you do that, and then you don't want to do your work anymore, but it's almost the exact opposite. When I have these outlets in my life, it actually makes me more creative in the work that I do. It makes me willing to return to the things I'm doing in my work, because now it's a sense of variety in my life, and I have this outlet of creativity and fun and passion that spills over into every area of my life. It affects every area of my life. Now, next week, we're going to return to this issue of play and talk more about how to really implement this in our lives and to our schedule. But this week, we want to discuss some of the blocks to action that we face and some of the tools to overcome them. Neil opens up with the serenity prayer in his chapter 6, which most of us know. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And he plays around with that. He calls it the stress prayer, which is pretty funny and comical, but sadly very true of most of our lives. And it basically says this: grant me the stubbornness to struggle against things I cannot change, the inertia to avoid work on my own behaviors and attitudes which I can change, and the foolishness to ignore the differences between external events beyond my control and my own controllable reactions. But most of all, grant me a contempt for my own human imperfection and the limits of human control. That's called the stress prayer. Now, in this chapter, Neil discusses 3 tools to get us moving and get beyond procrastination. Some of them deal with how to implement the idea from last week, such as leisure, into our daily lives, but the leisure component is going to come into play a lot more even so next week than this one. Now, each of these tools is meant to combat a problem that tempts us toward procrastination. And these are the 3 kind of problems that he identifies. The first one is feeling overwhelmed. And this can be a roadblock for us to start acting on something. We just feel totally overwhelmed by it. The second thing is the fear of failure or the fear of being imperfect. And then the third thing is the fear of not finishing. So let's dive into the first block, and that is feeling overwhelmed. This is a huge problem for many of us. We can be faced with big projects, and they could even be minor projects, but seem big. We just don't know where to start. We feel overwhelmed by it. There seems to be so many moving parts, so many different tasks that are involved in it that we become stuck. We start worrying about making mistakes. We fear failure. We dwell on how much work must be done. It just seems overwhelming to us, and our procrastination then is a way to push it away. We don't want to face this. I don't want to think about it. It's depressing me. It's boring me. It's stressing me out because it seems so overwhelming to me. I just don't even know where to start. It just seems like it's going to take me forever. We become overwhelmed by it, and procrastination then is a natural reaction to try to shelter us from that pain in our lives. And many times with these types of projects, what happens is that we are simultaneously trying to live in all states of the project at one time. We're trying to live in the beginning of the project, getting it started. We're trying to live in the middle of the project when we're really getting going with this. And we're trying to live in the end when we're trying to wrap it up and trying to get it off of our plate. This is what Neil refers to as two-dimensional thinking, where we're not seeing the full picture. We're overwhelmed too much by the details and trying to live in the beginning, middle, and end of a project or task. Now, another big factor, and Neil doesn't really mention this in his book, but it's a huge theme for me. You guys have heard me talk about this. I've dedicated a whole podcast episode on the fact of seeing your life as a journey, not a destination. And I think this is a huge, huge idea that we must plant in our head. And I think one negative paradigm that people often deal with here, especially in feeling overwhelmed, is that they're not seeing this task, this job, this project, whatever it is, they're not seeing it as an adventure. They're rather seeing it as a destination. And when you see something too much as a destination, it can overwhelm the adventure that lies in front of you. This is often why people don't want to get started, because they are thinking too much with the end in mind. Now, I'm going to kind of contradict this because I'm going to tell you in just a minute to think about the end first. But still, I think it's very important that when we do what Neil is talking about in this chapter, which I think is a tremendous idea to get us moving, we must always see our now moment as an adventure and not lose sight of that. There is something to be done today, and it's exciting. It can be full of passion and creativity if you just allow it to. Some of us can become very critical that we are only starting, and we get down on ourselves. Oh, I'm just starting. I should be so much further along than I am. Others feel that they must be very competent at something at the very beginning, instead, again, of seeing it as an adventure, as a learning, and as a growing along in the journey of something. We get overwhelmed because I feel like I must be a master of this already, and I don't want to afford myself a learning opportunity. I want to just get in there and do it and not have to learn something in the process. But probably more than anything, many of us insist in our minds, maybe subconsciously, we feel this way. We might not voice it completely, but we insist that there is only one right way to start something. And this is what stalls us. This is what makes us feel overwhelmed. Because if you believe there is only one way to start some project out of a million different ways, it's very much a needle in the haystack type of thing. You feel overwhelmed because you feel like you must start off perfectly, and therefore you're afraid to start, or you don't know where to start because it just is an overwhelming task to start perfectly in some facet. The fact is, we need to really drill this in our heads, especially if you think you deal with this. There are many, many good starting points to any project or task or job. There are many ways that you could do it and end up with very acceptable, very pleasing, very awesome results in the end. You don't have to start it just one way. And we've dealt with this whole episode of failure. That may be a great starting point. If you started something and you failed in the process, that could be a tremendous learning process to enable you to succeed in that very task. So we've got to quit worrying about failure. We've got to quit worrying about that there is only one way to start this. The point isn't that you pick the best or the optimal starting point. The point is that you pick one and you get started, that you just pick something and get moving. Quit worrying about picking the best starting point. Just pick a way to start and start working on it. Now, this is a task that you have to really learn, a paradigm, a way of thinking that takes a little bit to get used to if you're really dominated by this perfectionism. I must start off perfectly. And you realize, no, I don't have to start off perfectly. I just need to start. I just need to find the on-ramp, wherever that is, pick what I consider to be a good way of starting it, but don't be obsessed with it, and start moving. You know, I don't know if you've ever been lost on the highway before, but if you feel like you're lost and you stop the car, you're never really going to know where you're at. You're just going to sit there in whatever lostness that you're in. But if you start moving down the road, you may see a sign that says east or west or north, and you're saying, oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to be going south, and that says north. I'm going in the wrong direction. Or you see a sign to a city, or you see something, a landmark or something. The fact is, if you're moving somewhere, you're much more likely to course correct and fix things and get into the place you want to be. But if you're standing still on the side of the road, paralyzed about the fact that you don't know where to start and you feel lost, you won't ever really get anywhere in that state. You've got to get moving on things. And the minute you start moving on things, you can course correct. If you're going down the complete opposite path of where you need to go, you will immediately know, or you will soon know, just by the fact of moving on that pathway, that, oh, wait a minute, this is not the one I want to be on. And then you can adjust from there. Now, in the book, Neil suggests a technique to overcome this feeling overwhelmed. He calls it the reverse calendar. And quite honestly, I don't think this concept is new to Neil and is probably phrased in very different ways. I don't think it's unique to him in any way. Basically, the idea is that you break up a big project into smaller chunks. You start with the ultimate deadline, the ultimate goal, and you start breaking up into smaller chunks. Then you start putting this into your calendar backwards. So you start with the ultimate deadline, and let's say the ultimate deadline is in March. You set the deadline there. This is where I want to be. This is what I want to have done. Then you start working backwards and start filling in your calendar with the smaller parts of that, the smaller pieces that are going to help you get to that goal. And you start scheduling those in February. You start scheduling some more of those in January. You schedule out all the way back to the very beginning of where you are today. This is called the reverse calendar. So let me give you an example of that, and let me go to me writing these songs that I've been telling you guys for the last few weeks. As of today, I'm happy to say I've written 3 full songs since I started this project basically 2 weeks ago, and I have parts to another 6 songs that I hope to finish in a few days, and I'm well on my way to have 14 songs, which was my goal. I want to basically put out 2 albums worth of material, about 7 songs, and I have so much interest in music. I just picked a couple of genres to start with, and then I want to move into some other genres after I successfully complete this particular project. But okay, I have to write 14 songs. That's my goal. And this is a leisure activity, but it could be a job type of thing as well. This is a huge task. It feels honestly overwhelming. How am I ever going to write 14 songs? How am I going to do that? Where do I even start? I have so much fear, so much anxiety, so much stress of thinking about how am I going to pull this off? I want to do this. Well, first, I have to set the ultimate deadline. Now, if this is a job-related thing, somebody else may have already set that for you. You must have this done by this date. So you may have no choice as far as what the deadline is. In my case, since I'm doing this as part of a creative outlet in my life, I do have a say in this. I can set that deadline. And what I decided to do is to set this deadline for April 2nd, which is actually my birthday. I want to be finished recording and mixing all of these songs, all of these 14 songs by April the 2nd. That is my ultimate deadline. Now, if I have them published and they're on iTunes or wherever, then great. That would be wonderful. But my goal is that I want to be at least to that point by April. So I want to have all these songs done and basically then just worry and figure out how to get it out, like on iTunes, or if I want to make CDs or anything like that. That's what I want to do in April. I want to be done with the whole album by then. So I sit there and think, okay, April 2nd is my ultimate deadline. That leaves me 3 months to do this. That leaves me January, February, March. So I start working backwards. Okay, if I'm going to have songs done, what's the step right before having songs done? Well, I need to mix the songs. So, okay, that's the next to the last step. So I'm going to choose to do that in March. Well, what do I need to do before I mix the songs? Well, I need to record the songs. Okay, so I'm going to record the songs in February. Well, what do I need to do before I can record the songs? Well, I need to write the songs. So, okay, that's what I'm going to do in January. Then I'm working backwards, and that leads me to the present day, because when I started this, it was around January the 2nd or 3rd of 2014. If you're listening to this at later dates, it'll kind of help explain some of the dates I'm tossing out here. So this gives me the skeleton structure, the big kind of blocks that is going to ultimately lead me to having an album of songs recorded and mixed and written by then. It's all the blocks needed to get there. And I look at this and I think, okay, 3 months seems reasonable. It's going to be tight. It's going to push me hard. I've never done anything like this before in my life. It's a dream of mine. I'm going to pursue this. I'm going to push myself. This is going to work out good. But now I start filling out even more details. I start working out specific dates. So for example, in January, if I'm going to write 14 songs in January, that means that I need to be writing a song about every 2 to 3 days. So in my calendar, either paper, on my phone, computer, or at worst in my head, I'm blocking out things like song number 1 needs to be written between January 1st and January the 3rd. Song number 2 between January 4th and January 6th. Song number 3 between January 7th and 10th, and so on. Now, to make this work, some songs I'm only going to give myself maybe 2 days, or maybe I dedicate more time on some days like Saturday to work on multiple songs at once. Now, when you're in a particular job or task, you may have little flexibility if you do get behind, but I'm not shooting for perfectionism here. I'm not beating up on myself if all of a sudden I haven't written my second song by January the 6th, if I miss that deadline, I'm saying, okay, let's get busy. Let's get this going. Can I finish it on January the 7th then? And get back up and keep moving forward. There's many times when I would get so frustrated, and I've seen this often in just thinking of eating good or working out, where if I missed a day or two, then I get so frustrated with myself that I miss like 2 or 3 weeks in a row because I'm just so frustrated that I wasn't perfect in this and I didn't hit it exactly. And this is a learning process for me where I'm saying, hey, it's okay to be less than perfect. Would you rather be potentially perfect and write 3 songs in your entire life, or be a little less than perfect and maybe write hundreds of songs in your lifetime? You can choose which one you'd rather do. Because fact is, after many, many years of my life, I can tell you that perfectionism doesn't make me more productive. It doesn't push out more of things like this. And from my track record, I know that if I'm going to insist on being just perfect on even something like this, it's going to kill the creativity and passion in me, and I'm going to get less done. Quite frankly, I'm not going to get nearly as much done as if I just relax, use this as a guide for me to push me toward this goal, but don't feel like I have to be completely perfect in it. Just keep moving forward one step at a time and keep moving toward my potential. So if I mess up one day, then get right back up and go after it the next day. And forget the day that I messed up. Keep pushing forward. Keep seeing if I can't, by the end of January, have these songs done. So this is a reverse calendar, starting with the ultimate deadline, breaking it up into manageable pieces, smaller parts that I can accomplish during time, and start working backwards into my present moment, writing this down, scheduling it down, something that is small, something that is actionable, something that I can do. So you notice I don't have in my planner, write 14 songs. Oh my gosh, what does that mean? When am I going to do that? No, write 1 song, write this type of song, write the chorus. I could break it down like that. Write the chorus of the song on January the 1st. Write 1 verse on January the 2nd. Write 2 verses on January the 3rd. I can break it down into small, actionable steps, something that is easy for me to do. And guess what? By January the 3rd, I have written a song. And then by the end of January, I've written 14 of them. It just is a very manageable way of how to get moving on things. You've got to think small. Especially the bigger something is, you've got to make it small in your mind. You've got to make it of something such that you can really do it and get away from the big idea of what it is. Again, get away from this destination mentality and start embracing the adventure of what you can do today and what is something, no matter how small or insignificant in your eyes, what is something that is pushing you at least 1 step, 1 millimeter even. Now, this is something I felt in my dissertation I've mentioned many times. There were many days when I would just beat up on myself because I felt like I needed to be so much further along. And I kept telling myself, Brandon, even if all you did was move forward 1 millimeter, that seems so insignificant. In a month from now, look at where you're going to be, and you're going to be that much more closer to where you want to be. You may not have traveled a mile, but you're going to be a foot closer, or you're going to be a yard closer to your ultimate goal, and that's all that matters. So quit beating up on yourself. If all you did today was 1 millimeter of work, you're now closer to realizing your dream. Now, for this reverse calendar, notice that the emphasis isn't at first on where to start this huge project. That's another really nice feature about doing this, because so many times we want to know right immediately, where do I start? What do I start doing? Well, no, instead, start at the end and work backwards to where you are now, and it will become very apparent if you do this exercise where you should start working and then where to go from there. Basically, you begin with the end in mind. Start with the end and then start breaking it up into manageable little segments, little pockets of things that you can do. Work all the way up to your present moment and then start doing it. The benefits of doing this is that there's not one big deadline, but rather there are smaller deadlines. And another benefit of this is there's a lot of satisfaction upon completing these smaller milestones. Like again, in my song illustration, and I'll move on to some other illustrations after this, but in my song illustration, I've gotten a lot of satisfaction knowing that I've already completed 3 songs. This is amazing. This is more than I created all of the last 3 years. I've created more songs in 1 week than I have in 3 years of my life. And that is extremely satisfying to me. And it gives me the courage, it gives me the passion to get back in there and do it more and to keep going after this dream of mine. And you do this, and when you break things up into manageable steps. If I'm sitting there thinking, okay, when am I going to step back and just relish in what I've done, to luxuriate in what I've done? If I'm going to wait till the ultimate deadline of having written and recorded and mixed 14 songs, I'm going to live in frustration because that seems overwhelming. Will I ever get there? And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, the pathway to that, working backward, today, write one song. And I look and I get immediate gratification. Wow, I've written a song. I've written 3 songs. This is wonderful. I'm getting the benefit of those smaller deadlines that is adding fuel to keep pushing me forward to the ultimate deadline. So this is a wonderful way to work in your life, especially if you deal with procrastination. Try it out. See if it works for you. The reverse calendar. I think it would benefit you greatly. Okay, the second roadblock is the fear of failure or being imperfect. Now, again, I've done a whole podcast on this, and I would encourage you to refer back to the podcast I did on the fear of failure and to listen to that if you haven't done that yet. But a big facet of the fear of failure, being imperfect, is worrying. And we worry, I've mentioned this before in a previous podcast episode, that to me, worry is basically stewing without doing. It's basically just running in circles. And one area of this, and that is very much something I've had to overcome in my life, is that we subconsciously worry about not being number 1 at something. To us, being number 2 is the same thing as failure. And we simply must learn to get beyond this. And it's possible. It's possible to get beyond this with a focused intention to realize that that is not the truth. Now imagine if your favorite sports, whatever it happens to be, soccer, football, basketball, baseball, golf, whatever the case may be, imagine if your favorite sports team or your favorite player refused to play out of fear for being number 2. So you're watching basketball, let's say, and you love LeBron James, and LeBron James is sitting there saying, I want to be number 1, but if I don't know exactly I'm going to be number 1, I'm just not going to play. I so fear being number 2, I just will quit playing basketball. Now, how sad that would be if that person quit doing something like that because they feared being number 2. And many times they may be number 1 like LeBron James has been, and occasionally they may be sad that they come in number 2. I don't know many people that are delighted when they lose the Super Bowl or some championship game. That doesn't make them excited. It may make them quite sad, but it doesn't stop them from playing the game. They get back in there and they say, okay, I didn't come in number 1 this time. I'm going to work on it for next time. They don't let these failures derail them. They get back in. They keep pushing themselves toward their potential. In education, there are 2 types of tests. One's called a criterion reference test, and one is called a norm reference test. And many of you have seen the norm reference test. The norm reference tests are more of your standardized tests that you might see to get into college in America, especially things like the ACT or the SAT. Norm reference basically means that you take a test and then you're compared to all other students who take that same test. So then your score is a reflection of how you do compared to other students. Whereas a criterion reference is more that you're compared against a criteria. You're compared against some objectives that you must master, and therefore you're not really compared against other students. Your score is more a reflection of how much you know of the material. And there's benefits to both types of tests, but norm reference tests have come under a lot of criticism, obviously, because you're being compared to other people. And without talking about the merits or the disadvantages of that type of thing, I think for our lives, many times we live with this norm reference mentality that we are always comparing ourselves to other people. So we want to know how much money other people are making so we can feel good or bad about how much money we make. Or we're trying to compare our performance to their performance. And we're constantly, this is why we get into all these number 1, number 2 type of things, because we're comparing ourselves against someone else. Your life is not always about norm reference. We've got to quit comparing ourselves to other people. Instead, you need to have a criterion reference point. You need to find your true north, what really motivates you, what makes you passionate in life, and compare yourself to that. So are you really pursuing your first things? And if you're not, then you're off balance. And quit comparing yourself to someone else who is doing something that maybe you shouldn't even be doing in the first place. You've got to quit doing this to yourself. And we'll talk about this in just a minute, a little bit more. But what we need to do and what Neil talks about is to, if you're going to worry about things, then use it to your advantage. The problem is with worry for many of us is that we stop short of really seeing it all the way through and using it to our advantage. We use it to the point that it stalls us in life and we don't really push through to the other side. We need to really see ourselves through in the whole worry process. We need safety nets. Remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the high wire example. The high wire example of where you're trying to cross over to the other building. And if you do that 10 stories above the ground, you're going to do that in great fear. But if you know there's safety nets right under to catch you, then it might actually be kind of fun. We need to develop these safety nets in our lives. So the way that Neil talks about this in the book is that you should ask yourself a series of questions when you start worrying, when you start fearing failure, when you start fearing being imperfect. And the first thing you ask is, what is the worst that could happen to me? So you ask yourself, okay, if I fail at this, what is the worst thing that could happen? I get chewed out by my boss. I don't get the raise. Oh, I get fired from my job. Okay, what is the worst that could happen to you? In the case of my songs, what's the worst thing that could happen if I don't succeed in that? Well, the worst thing is I don't live out my passions. And, I go through all these types of things. Then the next thing you ask is, what would I do if the worst really happened? And really pick that idea apart. What would I do? And then what would I do after that? And then what would I do after that? And get very specific here. Not just, oh, it would be awful. That's what would happen. It would just be awful. No, specifically, what would you do? So let's take a really bad case that you lose your job. Okay, well, what would you start doing then? Okay, well, I would start looking for work. Okay, well, then what would you do? Well, worst case, I might have to move to a different city. Okay, and then what would you do? Just go through all the scenarios of what's the worst case in this particular instance. And what you're going to find if you do this, especially if you compare it to your life and your history, is that there really is no event that is so terrible that it can ultimately stop you, especially if you don't allow it to. The only thing that really stops us is ourselves. When we, like I said earlier, get in our automotive of life mentality and we just stop and refuse to keep driving, that's what stops us, is ourselves. If you don't stop yourself, then failure is not going to stop you ultimately if you don't allow it to. Keep getting back up, keep moving forward. But this is a great exercise to really break apart. Okay, so what is the worst that happens to me? Okay, this is the worst that could happen to me. This is what I would do in this particular situation. Then ask yourself, okay, how would I lessen the pain and get on with as much happiness as possible if the worst did occur? So this is from Neil in the book. I'm quoting him now. He says, if all else has failed and I find myself confronted with my most dreaded situation, am I prepared to shorten the depression and self-criticism by forgiving myself for being human, vulnerable, and imperfect? How would I return to the task of improving my life regardless of how bad things get? I must remember those strengths I can build on, strengths that have gotten me through situations in the past that seemed impossible at first. What can I learn from my past achievements about coping with adversity, about my hidden talents, about the strengths that reveal themselves just when I need them? The next thing to ask yourself is, what alternatives would I have? There are many, many paths to happiness and success. As we said earlier about in the starting of things, we've got to see that there are many ways that we can actually succeed. What alternatives would I have? Then ask yourself, what can I do now to lessen the probability of this dreaded event occurring? You see how we're using worry to basically come full circle back to where we're now at in the present moment. So, okay, I'm worried about starting, I'm worried about finishing, I'm worried about doing anything because I may fail. And if I fail, this is going to happen. Okay, now we really pick this apart. Okay, if we're going to go that way, what if that did happen? What if that were really bad thing happened in my life? What would it mean? How would I respond to it? How would I get over it? Now, is there anything I can do to lessen the probability, the chances of this dreaded event occurring? Is there something I can do even small to lessen the chance that this even happens? And then the last thing, we've come full circle now, is to ask ourselves, is there anything I can do now to increase my chances of achieving my goal? I've dealt with all of the worst case. This is the worst that can happen, and here's what's going to happen if it comes to that. Now, what can I do to achieve the goal today? The thing that is in front of me today. What can I do? Neil says this in his book. He says, after you have considered the worst, made plans for how to deal with it if it occurs, and assured yourself that you have alternatives, you can ask yourself, is there anything I can do now to increase my chances of achieving my goal? Having established a sense of safety by knowing that even in the worst imaginable situation, you have alternatives, you are ready to do your best without the burden of fear of failure. So basically what Neil is suggesting, the way that you deal with the fear of failure is to address it head on and say, okay, what if that happens? What if I do fail? What if the worst happens out of this? And deal with all those possibilities in your mind and then get them out of your system and then move on. And this is a very effective technique for dealing with the fear of failure. It isn't the only way of dealing with the fear of failure. Again, I would suggest you go back to my podcast on the fear of failure to listen to other techniques that you can use to address this. But this is a very effective way of dealing with the fear of failure, of not trying to suppress those feelings, but addressing them head on, saying, okay, so what? If this happens, what's the worst that could happen? Let me deal with that. What would I do? Now, let me get back to the task at hand and get moving and get starting on this. Now, we have to be honest about this. The reason why this is important, the reason why this works, is because we are not perfect. And to expect perfection is simply naive. Perfectionism traps us because we fear failing, and thus we don't want to be number 2. We don't want to be number 3, or we don't want to make mistakes. But here is the simple truth. You ready for this? It may not be something you want to hear if you really deal with perfectionism, but here's the simple truth. You are not always going to be number 1. You will make mistakes. So live with it and own it. Now, face your fears of failure, prepare for the worst, deal with those emotions, and don't bottle them up by procrastination, and then get on with living now. And then the last obstacle that Neil talks about is the fear of not finishing. Now, some of us actually are good starters. It's the finishing that we have trouble. There could be a variety of issues here, from a fear of success, a boredom, fear of judgment or failure again, or simply being overwhelmed with the work later on. We may not be overwhelmed with the work at the beginning, but then maybe it gets to us later on in the process. The thing we have to remember is that you can always take one more step. At some points, you might have to quit thinking about the ultimate goal and simply take the next step. Like I mentioned earlier, in my case, where I felt like if I was to measure what I did today, it felt like 1 millimeter. It felt like something totally insignificant, and I was almost ashamed that this is what my work was today on this particular task. And I have to instead see it from the other angle. Do you realize that even this small 1 millimeter, you're closer to where you want to be? This is a celebration. You should be upset if you moved nowhere today, but if you move just one little bitty step forward, you're that much closer to your goal. So to go back as an example to my dissertation, chapter 2 in a dissertation is typically a literature review. And the goal of this is that you do an exhaustive, and I mean exhaustive, research on what everyone has ever written on the topic you're writing your dissertation on. And you break it apart. Everybody that's written on it, that's had something to say about it, you are going to basically write the ultimate book report. This is basically what everyone said on this subject. And the goal in that is that you're trying to find where your niche is. Okay, this is the whole universe on this topic. And if you notice, there's a little gap right here. That's where I'm going to do something in. And you justify basically through this exhaustive research where your study fits in. Well, for me, chapter 2 is the most boring part of that whole process. Very intimidating for me, very stressful for me. And basically what I did was what we talked about earlier. I did the reverse calendar, and I knew it was time to work on this particular part. So here's my reverse calendar. I'm going to write chapter 5, chapter 4, chapter 3, chapter 2. So I'm doing good. Well, chapter 1 was wonderful. Then I hit the next month, and now I'm on chapter 2, the one that I dread, the one that is horrendous to me. And 2 days into it, I felt overwhelmed. I felt bored. I felt stuck. And it was then that I had to keep telling myself, just take the next step. Just write another page and quit thinking so much about it. So I'm sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be 50 pages of stuff. And I can't even write, 10 pages. And I'm thinking, okay, quit thinking about that. Just write one paragraph. Can you do that today, Brandon? Can you write just one paragraph today? That's stupid. Why on earth would I've got 50 pages of this thing to write, and I've got all this stuff I know you've got to do all this stuff. Quit thinking about that. Can you write just one paragraph today? Well, yeah, I could write one paragraph today. Well, then do it. Write one paragraph today. Yeah, but you don't understand. That's so insignificant. Quit worrying about that. Can you write one paragraph today? Yes, I can write one. See, I had to have this inner dialogue, this battle with myself to get over this and simply take one step forward. And guess what? If I write one paragraph today and one paragraph tomorrow and one paragraph the next day, I've written a whole page in 3 days. And yes, I would love to be finished with that whole thing in 3 days, but 3 days, I am one page out of 50, and I'm starting to gain momentum. I'm starting to break apart this complex task into these smaller things. I'm making a step forward, and that's the whole point. Get moving and take a step forward, and many times you've got to quit thinking about things so much. So along that theme, Neil identifies some negative statements and attitudes that we need to address. For instance, I need to do more preparation before I can start. And this is a justification for why we procrastinate. Oh, I just need more prep work. Well, if you are legitimately working, then prep can be kind of good. But if you find that you aren't working, it can just be an excuse for procrastination. Rather, a better place might be to remind yourself that there isn't a right way to start. So instead, limit your preparation and get moving. Or better yet, get moving, then pause to see if you need to go back and do a slight preparation after you've experienced it. The point is, get moving and step forward in this. Another excuse, at this rate, I'll never finish. We can be dominated by that thought. And it makes us hard to finish because we're sitting there thinking, I'm never going to finish it if I don't speed it up, if I don't do more work. But anytime we start something, we've got to remember it's going to always be slow for us. Do you remember the first time you rode a bike or you learned to drive a car or you did something like math and algebra? Sometimes it's slow at first. It takes a little bit to develop those neurons in your brain to tell you how to react in situations and how to feel and think. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. You should expect this. When you start something new, expect that it's going to take you a little bit of time to finish this. It isn't unusual. It isn't bad. So don't judge your future rate by your current one. Some of us get dominated with the thought, I should have started earlier. Well, instead, be thankful you have started. Most people don't. So instead of beating up on yourself, be thankful you did take a step forward. Now, take another step. If you feel overwhelmed, revisit your reverse calendar. Also, are you actively engaged in guilt-free play? What we talked about last week. If not, you need to get into that. And we're going to talk about that more next week. Here's another dominating thought. There's only going to be more work after this. And that makes us not want to finish because we fear what happens when we finish this. Are they going to give us even more work that we have to do? And simply, we can't borrow trouble. We can't attempt to live in tomorrow. You can only live in the now. And also remember, you always have a choice. So don't attempt to live in the choices of tomorrow when you have today's choices to live in. Now, here's one that's really big for some of us. It's not working. And that makes us feel stuck. We don't feel like it's working. We don't feel like we're getting anywhere. And this is what Neil says about this. He says, self-talk such as I'm trying, but it's not working. What's wrong? Can indicate perfectionism and a failure to do the work of worrying to develop alternative plans to make this project succeed in spite of difficulties. A certain amount of discomfort is natural in stretching beyond your comfort zone into a new level of skill. Difficulties and negative thoughts are not a sign to give up, but a signal for you to be creative in either resolving the difficulty or going around it. Rather than hoping for a perfect path with no problems, you can maintain a resolute commitment to make things work on this path. As a producer, you are not testing a system to see if it can make your project painless, nor are you looking for the fantasized perfect plan with no problems. You are focusing on the desired results and making this path work for you. And then the last negative statement, I only need a little more time. Now, this has a lot to do with perfectionism and fear of failure. Again, I once asked one of my professors how long he tweaked articles before he published them or right before they were about to publish. And he basically told me that he tweaked them until the day they told him to quit tweaking, that he couldn't do it anymore. This is the last day. We've got to send this in order for it to be published. Quit working on it. And to me, that isn't very productive nor efficient. You should do your best work, but at some point, you've got to let it go. Again, going back to my writing songs, I can get in my head that I need to write the next Let It Be by Paul McCartney, the Beatles. And instead of just writing songs I enjoy, I can get this mentality and then I have to tweak it. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be this grandiose song that everyone's going to know for 100 generations. And I tweak it until it's absolutely perfect. And instead, what I'm having to do is learn to embrace imperfections. In fact, it's often the imperfections that make music so magical. Now, here's a big secret. And this is something that I've learned in my life. I want to pass it on to you. If you've never heard it before, maybe it's going to be very common sense when I say it. Big secret in this area. You will always face criticism and rejection by some people, no matter how perfect something is. Let me say that again. You will always face criticism and rejection by some people, no matter how perfect something is. It is a fantasy to think what you consider perfect is beyond criticism. So if you push perfectionism to avoid criticism, you are fighting a losing battle. Well, wow, that's a lot of stuff to talk about today. We've gone over quite a bit of stuff. And so let's stop here and wrap up this episode on overcoming blocks to action. And there's more stuff we could say about that, and we may end up saying a little bit more next week. Next week, we're going to deal with what Neil calls the unschedule, in which we return to the fact that we need guilt-free play in our lives. We're going to talk about how to practically make that happen and how to embrace what we talked about this week with what we talked about the previous week, and let's put it all together in a way that we can really impact our lives. How do we do that practically in our day-to-day lives? How do we mix these two topics together? Now, as always, please consider leaving me a rating and comment on iTunes. Just helps me get the word out, as always, and I appreciate all that you guys have done for me in that regard, when you've left me comments, when you've rated me on iTunes. Now, new this week, I think I may have mentioned this last week, but I've checked it out. I have put this podcast on a platform called Double Twist, and this is more for Android users. You can also download this on your computer. So if for some reason you don't have Apple products, or you don't want to use iTunes, and you don't have access to this any other way except for maybe my webpage, but you do have an Android phone, you can download Double Twist for free. Then go in there, go to the podcast section, and then just search for First Things, and then you should be able to subscribe and do it from there. If you have any friends or family that you think would benefit from this show, and they are Android users, then encourage them to check this out. Tell them, hey, install Double Twist, do it, go into the podcast area, search for this First Things podcast. I think you'd really benefit from it. I think you would like it. I think it would help you out. And just trying again to find some ways to reach out to even more people. So I would encourage you to check that out, especially if you are an Android user. Again, if you have any comments on this episode, I have a discussion area set up at firstthingsproductivity.com/23. So until next time, remember this: keep on starting, and finishing will take care of itself. Start with the end in mind, break it up into small segments, work backwards to where you have small, little bitty chunks that you can have major victories in. Start building toward those ultimate goals, and you're going to find your productivity shoot through the roof. Embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.